So, it's been a while. Sorry about dying on you all. I was caught up in burnout from my day job and executive dysfunction and got sent to procrastination prison. Speaking of prison, that brings me to the subject of today's video, but before we get there, let's get dressed a bit more appropriately for the situation. If the uniform wasn't a dead giveaway, today we'll be talking about the Callisto Protocol, a 2022 survival horror game. I'm way behind on the train, so let's just get right into it to avoid wasting any more time. Let me begin by going over the general premise in case you're like me and somehow managed to avoid any and everything about the game despite being super hyped around the time it was announced. In Callisto, you play as a cargo pilot named Jacob Lee, portrayed wonderfully by Josh Duhamel. After crashing onto the surface of Callisto, one of Jupiter's moons, you are forced into Black Iron Prison and now have to find a way to escape after a mutagen breakout sends the prison into chaos. Pretty standard stuff for a game in this genre, all things considered. With some of the developers from the original Dead Space team working on the project, you'd think the game would be an instant success, right? That was not the case, unfortunately, but after playing through myself, I think I know why. Let me preface this by saying I have never played any of the Dead Space games, and pretty much know absolute zero about them, aside from how 3 was a general disappointment compared to the first 2, and the fact they were heavily inspired by the original Resident Evil 4 in terms of mechanics and tone, according to an interview with the developers. That being said, I am a huge survival horror fan, especially when it comes to Resident Evil, and this game isn't survival horror to me. Sure, it's gory and does have occasional jump scares that genuinely get me, but I never felt a sense of dread while playing. Fellow video essay creator CheeseYeen has an amazing video going into detail on the subject and explains it a bit in his video on Bending in the Dark Revival. I'll leave links to both videos and his channel in the description, and I highly encourage and recommend giving them a look after this. To summarize the main points though, one of the main drivers of fear in a classic survival horror game is resource scarcity. It forces the player to make active choices on whether the risk versus reward is worth it when low on resources and seeking out more. It almost gives too much agency to the player, which creates a really fair feeling gameplay loop that makes each failure and death feel in their hands, but also intensifies that feeling of fear when it comes to making the choice to explore for the chance of more, and with each combat encounter you engage in versus choosing to run or take another way around. When you look at Callisto, it doesn't have any of that despite being advertised as a survival horror experience. There's no resource scarcity when it comes to your defenses, because the primary one you're encouraged to use is a melee weapon that doesn't have any sort of limited mechanic in any way, no durability, no charges for a stronger attack, or even to make it usable with the theme of it being an electric baton. Even with the guns you do use, they aren't properly balanced for a survival horror experience. Ammo is extremely generously given out from either enemy drops or just around the environment, but if that wasn't enough, there's still merchant stations throughout the game you can buy as much ammo as you want from. Sure, they're a bit rarer and spaced out, but if you're willing to backtrack through the places you've already cleared of enemies, then you basically have anything you want at most points in time if you're not physically stopped by an untraversable barrier. The same goes for health. Yeah, I was near constantly in the yellow, but I was never scared because I either had the means to defend myself or knew a heal was bound to show up soon enough to be patient. On the other hand, if I'm playing Resident Evil, no matter the game, I am religiously healing or keeping a careful eye on my health to know when the best time to heal is when I'm running low on healing items. That way, I don't waste a full heal on half health instead of waiting for when I'm more in need of it in the red. Because of this, I didn't really know what to think at first. The game was clearly trying to scare me, but it was making me too powerful to really feel any sense of danger or threat. But at the same time, I knew I was still able to die just as easily as I was able to take down enemies. It felt like this weird middle ground between a horror game and a power fantasy like the Doom franchise, where you're supposed to feel indestructible and just have a blast with the gore and action. Eventually, I got over it and was able to really get a feel for the environment, but sadly the problems didn't end there. The pacing is certainly a choice, to put it gently. The start of the game is extremely cutscene heavy and moves along quite quickly. 1 second running through the tutorial and the next you're suddenly already pitted against enemies without any sort of build-up. The first half of the game is pretty decently paced in all honesty, moving the objective along steadily while also making it clear something is going to get in the way with how fast it's happening in a sort of Resident Evil style sidetrack into the underground lab finale, or so I thought at least. About halfway through the game, after you escape the Habitat Dome, you end up in an underground city with what I refer to as liquor enemies, mostly because they're what comes to mind when I come across them, but they're probably just called blind enemies, because that's what they are, blind but sensitive to sound. Normally, I love these types of enemies. I enjoy opportunities to sneak around in action games, either for the chance to get a breather from the complex combat, or to simply have a little fun and pick enemies off one by one, or outright just avoid the waste, especially in resource management heavy games like the Resident Evil games. But the way these enemies are implemented creates the worst gameplay loop I've ever experienced. In such a long time, I don't think I've felt this way with a game since I played BioShock. I wouldn't call it rage quitting or actively hating the game, but it got to the point I was just waiting for it to end. Was part of it from me trying to beat the game in a day or two while I had the time off from work? Probably. I won't deny that likely had a part in my rush for it to be over, but it felt a bit like padding when I actually experienced it. Part of the reason I like Lickers in Resident Evil and other similar enemies is because they're carefully placed sections among others or purposely added to make a brief section even more difficult. Keyword being brief. In Callisto Protocol, you encounter nothing but the blind enemies for 2 whole chapters. Keep in mind, each chapter is about an hour or 2 long on a first time playthrough, if not longer due to deaths. That is anywhere between 2 to 4 hours of content, if not even longer, that has nothing but blind enemies that you are forced to stealth past by crouching, which makes you move even slower and keeps you stuck in the section even longer. On top of that, each combat encounter has 4 or 5 enemies, so you have to wait for who knows how long for the enemies to separate enough from each other in their patrol routes, so you can sneak up behind one and get out before the next one that's been on the other's ass the whole time doesn't run into you and aggro all the remaining enemies you haven't killed yet. The worst part is that in this section is one of the hardest and most annoying combat encounters of the whole game. It has about 4 or 5 blind enemies, and 1 enemy that can see you. So you have to kill the seeing enemy as fast as possible, and throw as many blind enemies as possible against the spike wall they provide you with your grip before its charge runs out, and hope you have only 2 or 3 enemies left, because all of the enemies in that arena can mutate into an even stronger type of enemy. Did I mention just how cramped the arena is as well? So if you have any more than 2 or 3 enemies, you'll get swarmed and unable to shoot the tentacles that trigger the mutation because all the enemies are bunched around you and get in your line of sight. This is also a required fight, not just something for an extra reward. Now, I'm not a pro gamer by any means. I'm shit at PvP games and I'm not good enough to play most games on anything above standard difficulty. But when I tell you this is one of the most difficult sections I've ever played in any game ever, this was harder than trying to play the Resident Evil 3 remake with a mouse that had a broken right click, so it was almost impossible to aim at the boss. And this section was even harder and more infuriating to play. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I need to convey how much of a drag the middle section of this game is. As I was making my way through the section, I already knew I did not want to play through the section again, hence why there's no footage of it in this video. I enjoy the first half of the game or so while you're still in the prison, but when you get out, the steady pace you've been going at the whole time grinds to a near complete stop and overstays its welcome far too long. I think it says something about the game design when people actively dread replaying your game rather than wanting to play it again. Not to mention, certain mechanics hard-coded into the game make it actively harder. For example, again, the tentacles. During combat, a majority of your attacks are auto-aimed, especially your melee attack. So that's part 1 of the game actively fighting against you, because if you have a bunch of enemies around you, like in the scenario I outlined before, you'll randomly target an enemy, which spreads the damage you deal. 1, making it take longer to kill enemies, and 2, making it much more sporadic as to when the mutations will trigger, and if you miss the extremely small window for preventing it, you're stuck with stronger enemies. Part 2 of the game actively fighting you is the auto-aim mechanic the combat system has for its combos. When you chain an attack, the game gets a prompt you can use that will automatically drag your reticle to the point it indicates. The only problem I have with the system is when you start encountering the mutated enemies, the auto-aim does not go towards the tentacles, which would be fine if the game didn't actively pull you away from it for the limbs or head instead. On top of that, it makes it even harder to pull away from the auto-aim point, which just wastes time and ammo for the mutation timer. Before I get into my feelings about the ending of the game, let me give you some context and share my feelings on the characters. In all honesty, they're pretty well done, and my only wish is that they did more with them and gave them more screen time. My personal favorite is Elias, likely due to him having so much screen time and the most lines in the game. I was weary of him betraying me or dying the whole time, but I managed to develop an attachment to him nonetheless, to the point I genuinely got misty-eyed when he died. Even the less fleshed out characters grew on me. Jacob is a bit of a stereotypical action protagonist, I won't deny that, but there's a certain charm to the way he's written like a generic dude bro. The best way I can describe it is the same charm Ethan Winters has. He's just an average guy who got thrown into something he wasn't ready for or meant to be a part of. Lastly, for our protagonists, Danny. I think she's the most underutilized of the trio in all honesty, especially considering how narratively relevant she is to the story, which seems to be a recurring trend. Her arc is decent enough and doesn't overstay its welcome, but like I said, I wish more was done with it, such as her having more dialogue with Jacob about what happened on Europa and giving us breadcrumbs as to why she has so much resentment for him and what she's accusing him of doing. Obviously, she can't just sit down and have a heart-to-heart with him randomly. I'm not saying she should act out of character, but perhaps during the scene where Jacob slides past the grate behind Elias after getting trapped in the shoe, we overhear Danny trying to convince Elias to ditch Jacob, sort of adding to her initial comment after shoving him into her cell of "don't trust him, he's not what he seems," giving us more context and insight into her character and motives a bit more than 5 minutes before the end of the game. Her monologue at the end was a perfect bittersweet send-off and almost stuck the landing in my opinion. Which leads me to my last point. Callisto was so close to greatness, and then 2 inches from the finish line, they fumbled it all. There are 2 main gripes with the ending I have. Firstly being how it wraps up the narrative. There are 2 main players in the ending, Warden Cole and Captain Ferris. The only problem is they haven't been involved in the story the whole time. You find a few voice logs about Cole being involved with the outbreak somehow, but we don't get any confirmation or any direct interaction with Cole until 30 seconds before the final boss fight. We have no motive to directly retaliate against him or personal vendetta that drives us to hate him. The same problem comes with the final boss itself, Captain Ferris. We come across Ferris a total of 5 times through the game, including the final boss fight. The first time is the initial cutscene where we get arrested, the second is where he dies and gets tackled out of the watchtower, the third when he launches us out of the airlock and gets Elias killed, and the fourth is a boss fight at the end of Chapter 7. I understand the intent the developers have with creating a vendetta against Ferris by having him kill a character the player likes and has a connection with, but the impact is lost when he barely shows up. Every time he appeared, instead of feeling, "It's you, the guy that got my friend killed," I just felt, "Oh my god, it's this guy again. You've literally done nothing this whole time." It's the same issue with Cole, where a stronger presence is needed to create that resentment. To attempt creating a sense of fairness, let's use an example from the franchise I've repeatedly compared this game to as the better version, Resident Evil. In this case, let's specifically look at Resident Evil 2, the remake because I haven't played the original yet. In RE2, we have multiple encounters with William Birkin. Birkin's emotional impact is almost entirely dependent on which playthrough you select, which makes sense for split-path games like Resident Evil. In Leon's Path, you don't really get that conflict with Birkin, which is fine because the final boss in Leon's playthrough isn't Birkin, it's Mr. X, which we do develop a vendetta against because we spent so long in the RPD evading him. However, he is the final boss in Claire's playthrough, which is narratively fitting because Claire's playthrough is centered around Sherry, his daughter. So putting the monster you encounter multiple times that's also her father as the final barrier between the player and saving said daughter is narratively fitting, because it concludes Claire's arc as her rescuer. Back to Callisto, again the same cannot be said for Ferris and Cole. Ferris is not enough of an active threat or taunting presence to create a resentment or active desire to defeat him aside from, "It's a video game, I have to beat this boss to win." And Cole, while intriguing in the beginning, isn't elaborated on enough throughout the game to maintain that intrigue for a satisfying Resident Evil style underground lab ending that I expected to get. My second problem with the ending is how much the publishers show in the way it was handled. For those of you who don't know, while the developers themselves are made up of a good portion of the original Dead Space team, the publishers are a separate company entirely by the name of Krafton. Krafton is a South Korean company that has its hands in a variety of metaphorical video game cookie jars, one of which being the Sims killer LifeSim competitor Inzoi. For those of you who aren't LifeSim fans, Inzoi is notorious for, while being gorgeous, being extremely lifeless with an unsatisfying gameplay loop. The game is also extremely infamous for relying heavily on generative AI in a number of places, such as music, textures, and even including an in-game image generator that players can use. They have heavily invested in the technology since then and are extremely interested in utilizing it further. To me, and many other LifeSim fans, this displays a hunger for profit that's borderline negligent to the players in practice. Going back to my original point, I think this hunger for money is blatantly shown in the handling of the ending of Callisto Protocol. The ending starts off bittersweet, with Jacob accepting his portion of the blame for everything that happened throughout, even if he was acting more negligently ignorant than actively malicious. He sacrifices himself to save Danny in the singular escape pod, and she has a nice monologue on her thoughts on the situation and how her view of Jacob changed as she watches the prison go up in flames due to its self-destruct sequence. and it would have been just fine if things ended there. But they didn't, and I think I know exactly why. Again, the publishers at Krafton are extremely money hungry, and from bits and pieces I've picked up online about the game, it seems the sequel was planned pretty much from the start, and that's glaringly obvious in the way the ending was handled, by turning it into sequel bait instead of letting a decent, if poorly executed story rest then and there. When the game had a very rocky perception from the public, and the publishers realized the sequel wouldn't sell as well as the hype for the first game helped it achieve, they were left with a sequel bait ending that left too many questions unanswered. So instead of updating the game and finishing the story proper, or simply rolling out an update that cut the ending cutscene a few seconds sooner so we didn't see Jacob still alive, the team instead elected to roll out a paid DLC for the story's real ending, so to speak. I have taken no part in this DLC. I did not buy it, and as of writing this, I have not watched any videos containing the DLC's content, and I don't think I ever will. For starters, I am extremely anti-AI in terms of generative AI and its place in creative mediums such as game development. I completely agree it has its places as a tool or database for things such as medicine or even coding in game development, but when it comes to visual or audio art, I do not want any involvement whatsoever. Secondly, the fact that the publishers paywalled the ending to a story just displays the profit-first, consumer negligent mindset they have, and it rubs me the wrong way. So I refuse to let my money say I support such practices. I will clarify, I got the game for free, so I've got a bit more of an, oh well, all I wasted was my time outlook on the product than the people who were extremely excited for Dead Space's spiritual successor after 3 was received so poorly, and used their money to buy the game. My heart honestly goes out to them, and I believe they deserve better than what they got, even as someone who didn't share those same sentiments and attachments to the franchise. That being said, the experience wasn't entirely unenjoyable. I liked the first half enough, and once I gave up on the idea of finishing it in a day or two, I didn't mind the last couple chapters where they added some variety in the enemies again, and made the game less of a crawl through the mud. Would I recommend this to someone? Probably not, but I didn't completely hate the thing. I honestly think it boiled down to poor execution and missed potential with the resources they had at their disposal to make the experience more fleshed out and engaging than, it's a video game, I'll guess I'll progress to finish it. With this discussion out of the way, where's the channel going from here? Well, luckily for those of you who've stuck around that I am extremely grateful for, I have a small roadmap for the next few uploads. I want to do a Resident Evil Requiem video in honor of the release and the franchise's 30th anniversary, just generally going over the things I love about the series and how Requiem honors that so well. After that, I want to sink my teeth into a Bioshock video, going over my love-hate relationship with the franchise, because I do truly adore the world, but just can't love the mechanics themselves enough to put it above games like Resident Evil or mouthwashing. Until then, I do have the bones of an Iron Lung video I could put together if you guys are interested in my thoughts on that movie, and I can still release the previously promised discussion of Has Been Hotel Season 2 if that's still a subject of interest for you all. Other than that, I do deeply apologize for being gone so long, and I promise I'll try to be better with more consistent uploads. Thank you all so much for your support, and I'll see you the next time I crawl out of my rat den.